and welcome along to this next Lightroom tutorial. If you've been following the series so far, then you know we've been looking at how we can search the catalogue using things like text, and we can use attributes for ratings, that kind of thing, to search for photos. In this tutorial we're going to have a look at this option, Metadata. Your camera automatically records a whole load of information that we can use in Lightroom to search. This could include things like lens apertures, shutter speeds, whether a flash fired, or even things like GPS information. Let's have a look at what we can see. If we click on Metadata, we open it out, and by default we'll get about 4 columns of information. We're showing the date that the picture's taken, the camera that the picture was taken with, what lenses we've taken pictures with, and over here it's got the label. We can change what information is displayed here just by clicking on the actual title of the column. You see we get this little up and down arrow. If I click on it, we get a whole load of options that we can choose from. I'll just leave that as camera for now. The date one, there are a couple of extra options. If we click on the little menu option here, we can view it hierarchically or flat. If I go to flat, for example, you'll see actually every date is being listed out, whereas under hierarchical we can actually break it out by year and month and then the day. Some people like to rename their images based on the date that the image was taken. It may be more worthwhile to give it a more meaningful name, as the information about date is already trapped for us anyway. We can remove columns just by clicking on the menu option again up here and do remove this column, or we can add more columns in if we want to. We can actually add up to 8 columns before it will stop allowing us to add any more. I'm just going to remove this column, and you'll see now we've just got the straight 3 columns. Note that the options shown here are based on the highest level folder I have selected and everything below it. Now there is a slight caveat to that. We can actually turn off the subfolders effectively by going to Library, and this Show Photos in Subfolders can be disabled. And if I do that, you'll see now it's only actually looking in the one folder, Photos, and there's nothing in there. If I click on Bethany, for example, 3 pictures, go back to the metadata. So if you're not seeing everything you think you should see, it may just be worth checking Library and make sure that Show Photos in Subfolders is checked. That's true for any of these filters, so text and attribute, they all work based on the top level selected folder and the subfolders below it, depending on whether or not that subfolder selection is made. So let's have a look into more detail at what options we do have. We've discussed dates already. There are other things we can do. Under date, we can actually do it by the whole date. We can look by month. So for example, we could filter and it shows all the images taken in various months. And I've got no Christmas photos to show you. What a shame. We could do day. Again, not entirely sure how useful that is, but the option's there. File type. We've got various different types of files within our Lightroom catalogue. We've got DNG files here, for example, Photoshop files, straight raw files as TIFF file. So we can actually say, I just want to look at Photoshop files in the catalogue, that kind of thing. Go back to all. Flag, rating, keywords, these are all ones we could have done under attribute and text, so I'm not going to go through those in too much detail, but again, they are there as options if you want them. Camera, we've already got in this other column, but we can select images by the camera type that we've taken. The camera serial number even, which is another option. Again, not sure how relevant that is. Some people might find it useful. It's there if you need it. Lens, so we can see what type of photos we got by lens type. So we could be looking for a specific shot taken at a specific field of view for a demonstration, for example. That ability is there. Apologies, I missed one back there, edit, which basically allows me to see which photos I've actually edited in my catalogue, got changes to them, and which ones still remain as the original raw file or however they were imported. Next, we have focal length. So we can see what focal length various images were taken at. Could be useful if you're trying to decide what lens to buy next. You may find that your zoom lenses are all around about the same distance, so that could be useful. Shutter speed. This could be handy, for example, if you were looking for a specific shot where you wanted to show maybe a slow shutter speed and the effects of it. We can select a nice 15-second shutter speed there. We get a shot with a nice blurry water. or we could want to go to the other end and just see what really fast shutter speeds. I suspect most of these were fast because it was very bright. So shutter speed, aperture, likewise, we may be looking for a picture that's got very shallow depth of field. So here, for example, we've got stuff taken at f1.2, quite shallow, or we may want to look for something that's got very high depth of field. Again, I suspect this was mainly because it was a very bright day. Next, we have ISO speed. So again, more of the same. All our images, the different ISO speeds that they were taken at. Flash state, whether or not the flash fired or didn't fire. GPS data, if your camera has it and provides it, then this can get carried over automatically. You do actually have the option to input GPS data manually if you want to. We haven't talked about the metadata column over here, or panel I should say, over here. There is the option to enter GPS data manually, as there is most other metadata for that matter. We can put various pieces of information in. Map location, we haven't talked about maps, but one of the modules within Lightroom is the map, and we can actually tie things to specific locations. We'll look at that in some more detail another time. Location kind of falls under that. That's part of the metadata as well. City, state, so various location information. We can do it by who created it, what the copyright status is. We have the ability to put a job title into the metadata and we can search for that. Aspect ratio, so whether it's portrait, landscape for example, you may find 1:1 in there as well. Smart preview status, we haven't talked about previews yet, but we will do later on. It's giving us the ability to see what images we have with smart previews. Snapshot status, when we're editing pictures we do have the ability to create a snapshot which stores our edits to a point in time, and we can search for those. Treatment, whether it's black and white, colour for example. Develop preset, we can apply presets to pictures when we're importing them and as we start developing them, and we can search by the different presets that we may have applied. Metadata status, a bit of a strange one. If we change the metadata for a photo, it doesn't necessarily get written back to the disk for everything to see. It may only change in Lightroom. So this allows us to determine which ones have actually had metadata written back to the disk fixed. Depth, some modern cameras now, like iPhones for example, can provide depth information in the photo, and that option is really there for those newer cameras that give that LiDAR capability. You probably won't come across it much at the moment with most standard cameras, or none obviously. Why do we get the ability to create up to 8 columns? Well, we can combine these. So for example, I can select, for example, lens over here, and over here I could put aperture, and you'll see that as I change the options here, we'll get different options in aperture based on the lens selection. So we can combine information along those lines. I can combine the metadata with the other search options we have, like text and attribute. For example, I could say I want to look for, let's look at orientation. There we go, aspect ratio, portrait, landscape, and I want a portrait picture of, say, Emily. And there it is. If I wanted the landscapes, click on landscape. I mentioned earlier you have this metadata panel over here on the right hand side. If we expand that out, you can see here there's a whole host of information, some of it automatically created by our camera when it's imported. Some of it we can input manually, like the location information for example. There are different views of the metadata. If we just scroll up a little bit here, you can see we've got this EXIF and IPTC data set selected at the moment. If I click on that, we can get other views. Default for example gives us a quick overview of the picture. Location, we mentioned earlier about having things like GPS information. We can input GPS information here. So I tend to find this one has the most information that I need regularly, so that's usually what I have mine set to. You'll see in here it's got things like our rating. If you remember when we talked about color labels, we could input a color label here, titles, captions, all that sort of information. all sits under this section, and we can enter that manually, and then it's available for searching under the metadata option. Just finally, I mentioned earlier about the metadata status here. What we can actually do is we can select a file, and if we go to metadata, we can save metadata to file, and what that will do is any information we've updated in the metadata panel will be written back to that file so other applications can see the information. Otherwise it just stays purely within Lightroom. That's it for this tutorial on metadata, so hopefully I'll see you for the next one. Bye now.